"We got married yesterday," Chloe said. And in that one flat sentence, Evelyn Carter understood that her place in her own son's life had just been rewritten without her. For a moment she did not move. She stood in her bright Ohio kitchen with one hand resting on the counter, the morning light falling across a stack of unopened mail, while the phone stayed warm against her ear. She had only called to ask a simple question. She wanted to know the date, that was all. Daniel was her only son, and for weeks she had been careful not to sound too eager, too involved, too much like the mother Chloe always seemed to think she was. She had practiced being light about it. Casual. Cheerful. She had even smiled before dialing, glancing at the navy blue dress hanging from the pantry door, still sealed in its dry cleaning bag, waiting for the wedding she now realized had already happened without her. Chloe did not sound rushed or apologetic. She sounded amused, almost bored, as if she were reminding someone about a grocery pickup. In the silence that followed, Evelyn could hear dishes clinking in the background and the low hum of conversation, like other people were nearby, sharing a morning that had already moved on. "Daniel meant to tell you," Chloe added after a beat, in the same tone people used when they said your package might be delayed by a day. Evelyn swallowed and looked at the small notepad beside the phone, where she had written possible gift ideas in neat blue ink. Air fryer. Weekend getaway. Monogrammed towels. She had underlined towels twice. Her fingers tightened around the pen until the plastic bent. "Daniel meant to tell you." The words landed harder than the wedding itself. Not because she believed them, but because she knew exactly how they had been designed to sound, soft enough to excuse him, cold enough to dismiss her. Evelyn thanked Chloe somehow. She would not remember doing it, only that when the call ended, the kitchen became so still that even the refrigerator seemed too loud. She set the phone down carefully, as if anything sudden might crack the morning wide open. Then she looked around the room she had lived in for 34 years, the room where Daniel had eaten cereal before Little League games, where he had filled out college forms, where he had once sat at this very counter and promised that no matter what changed, she would always be included. Evelyn did not cry. Not then. She walked to the pantry door, touched the sleeve of the dress, and let her hand rest there for one long second before she slid it off the hook and folded it over a chair. At noon the first photos appeared online. She did not go searching for them. Her sister-in-law texted a single message, "Did you know?" followed by a row of wedding pictures that looked like they belonged in a bridal magazine. A white arch cream roses. Daniel in a tailored gray suit. Chloe smiling like a woman who had just won something expensive. In every frame there were guests. Friends. Her parents. A cousin Evelyn had mailed Christmas cards to for 10 years. There was a dinner, a dance floor, candles, champagne flutes, place cards written in looping gold script. It was not a rushed courthouse ceremony. It was not sudden. It was not private in the way kind people use that word. It was organized, photographed, catered, and shared. It had been planned in detail, down to the silk ribbon on Chloe's bouquet. The only thing missing was Daniel's mother. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and studied each image with the calm attention of someone reading a contract before signing it. That was when the hurt began to harden into something cleaner. Something sharper. This was not forgetfulness. It was removal. And Evelyn, who had spent most of her life being generous with second chances, finally understood the difference. By 3 o'clock, she had stopped staring at the photos. By 4, she had pulled out the family trust binder from the hall cabinet. And by the time the sun dropped behind the bare maple tree in her backyard, Evelyn Carter was no longer asking why she had been left out. She was asking who had decided she no longer mattered, and what exactly that decision was about to cost them. Daniel called just after 7 that evening, not because he was ready to explain, but because silence from his mother made him uneasy. Evelyn let the phone ring twice before answering, and when she finally lifted it, she kept her voice even enough to give him no comfort at all. He began with the same weak sentence Chloe had used, saying it all happened quickly, saying they did not want a big production, saying they thought it would be easier this way. Easier for whom, Evelyn wondered, but she did not ask it out loud. Instead, she listened to the careful softness in his tone, the one he had used as a teenager when he knew he had done something selfish and hoped kindness would erase the fact of it. He talked too much about logistics and not once about hurt. He mentioned scheduling, the venue, the photographer, a last-minute opening, a package deal that saved money. The more details he gave, the worse it became because every word proved the same thing. This had not been sudden. It had been arranged. It had been discussed. It had been funded. It had been celebrated. And throughout all of it, her absence had not been a problem to solve. It had been part of the design. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the trust binder closed in front of her, and watched the last strip of daylight fade over the yard. When Daniel finally stopped talking, perhaps expecting a tearful reaction or a relieved surrender, she asked only one question. She asked when exactly they started planning it. There was a pause on the line, small but fatal. Daniel said a couple of weeks, maybe 3. Evelyn looked down at the binder and remembered the Sunday dinner 2 weeks earlier when Chloe had smiled across the roast chicken and asked strange questions about whether Evelyn had plans to downsize, whether the big house was hard to manage, whether Daniel had ever been formally added to every account that mattered. At the time, the questions had sounded nosy. Now they sounded strategic. Daniel kept speaking, filling the silence with phrases that made everything worse. He said Chloe thought a smaller ceremony would reduce stress. He said they were going to celebrate later with everyone. He said Evelyn was overthinking it. That was the first sentence that changed something in her. Not because it was cruel by ordinary standards, but because it was careless in a way only grown children can be with mothers who have spent decades making their lives easier. Overthinking it. As if a woman who had raised him, fed him, paid for braces, sat through emergency room visits, and helped with the down payment on his first condo was now being unreasonable for noticing she had been erased from the most important day of his adult life. Evelyn leaned back in her chair and let the quiet settle before she answered. She said she was not overthinking anything. She said she was finally thinking clearly. Daniel went silent then, and she could almost feel him searching for the version of his mother who would smooth this over for him, the one who would accept any explanation as long as it kept the peace. But peace, Evelyn realized, had become another word for her own humiliation. After the call ended, she opened the binder and laid out the documents across the table in straight, tidy rows. Her late husband had believed in order, in signatures, in making sure generosity was protected from foolishness. There were trust terms, property notes, account instructions, a letter from the family attorney, and one clause Evelyn had not looked at in nearly a year because she had never imagined she would need to. It concerned transitional control of certain assets intended for Daniel after marriage, inheritance, and formal disclosure. She read it twice, then a third time slower. The language was precise, and for the first time all day, her breathing steadied. This was not revenge. It was not rage. It was governance. By 8:30, she had left a message for Robert Gaines, the attorney who had handled her husband's estate. By 9, she had printed screenshots of every wedding photo she had received. By 10, the navy dress was back in the closet, but not because Evelyn had given up. It was because she no longer planned to attend anything as a smiling extra in someone else's performance. Whatever Chloe thought she had won with flowers, photographs, and one carefully timed secret, she had misread the woman she had tried to sideline. Evelyn Carter had spent her life building a family. She had also spent it learning how quickly love turns expensive when gratitude disappears. Robert Gaines returned Evelyn's call at 8:15 the next morning, and by the time she set her coffee down, she already knew from the weight in his voice that he understood this was not a routine question about paperwork. Robert had known her husband for more than 20 years, and he had known Evelyn long enough to recognize when her calm meant something had shifted for good. She explained the facts without embellishment. Daniel had married Chloe in a fully planned ceremony. She had not been told before it happened. There were already photographs, guests, and what looked like a reception. She also mentioned the recent questions about the house, the accounts, and whether Daniel's marital status affected the timing of any transfers. Robert did not interrupt. He asked for the date of the ceremony, asked whether Daniel had formally disclosed the marriage to anyone connected to the trust, and then asked Evelyn to email every screenshot she had. When she finished, there was a short pause, followed by the kind of sentence that makes the room feel smaller and clearer at the same time. Robert said he would advise freezing any voluntary financial movement until a full review was complete. Evelyn looked out the kitchen window toward the backyard fence her husband had painted the summer before he got sick. The words did not shock her. They confirmed what instinct had already begun to say. Something about this had not merely been rude. It had been calculated. She spent the rest of the morning moving through the house with unusual precision. She did not pace. She did not call friends. She did not sit and replay the insult like a woman hoping pain alone would explain it. Instead, she gathered records. There were folders in the hall cabinet, older statements in the desk drawer, copies of tax filings in the guest room closet, and a slim blue file labeled Daniel home gift that she had not opened since the year she helped him with the condo purchase. Each page told a story she had once believed ended in gratitude. There was the cashier's check for the down payment. There were notes from her husband about helping Daniel get started without making him dependent. There was even a letter Evelyn herself had written but never sent, a gentle reminder drafted after Daniel first moved in with Chloe, saying support should never be mistaken for obligation. She read that letter once, then set it aside. Around noon, her younger sister Marlene called after seeing the same wedding photos everyone else had begun whispering about. Marlene was the kind of woman who believed in naming a thing plainly, and after 1 minute of disbelief she said what no one else had yet dared to say. She said Chloe had not married into the family. She had staged an entry and locked the door behind her. Evelyn did not fully agree, not yet, but the sentence stayed with her. By early afternoon, Robert sent an email asking Evelyn to come to his office the next day with original copies of the trust documents. He also noted one detail that made her read the message twice. The trust did not automatically transfer discretion once Daniel married. Certain steps depended on formal timing, notice, and good faith disclosure, especially where jointly influenced property decisions could affect long-term protections. Robert did not say Daniel and Chloe had done anything illegal. He did not need to. He was telling her, in professional language, that secrets can become very expensive when they collide with signed documents. Evelyn closed the email and sat back in her chair. Then she opened social media again. Not out of grief this time, but to study. Chloe had posted a fresh batch of photographs with a caption about intimate beginnings and protecting peace. Evelyn almost smiled at that. Protecting peace had become Chloe's favorite phrase whenever she wanted control without accountability. There was Daniel beside her in every frame, handsome and happy, but Evelyn noticed something she had missed the day before. He looked less like a man celebrating and more like a man following instructions. His smile never reached his eyes. His suit fit perfectly, yet his shoulders were tight. Chloe, on the other hand, looked radiant in the way people do when a plan has worked exactly as intended. Evelyn shut the laptop and folded her hands. The pain was still there, but it was no longer wild. It had edges now. It had order. Before dinner, Daniel sent a text asking whether they could all have brunch on Sunday and clear the air. Chloe added a heart reaction from his phone a minute later, as if that made the invitation warm. Evelyn read the message twice and understood immediately that this was not about reconciliation. It was about management. They had sensed movement on her side and wanted to get in front of it. For the first time since the wedding, Evelyn felt something almost like relief. People grow careless when they think an older woman will only respond with tears. Chloe was expecting shock. Daniel was hoping for forgiveness. Neither of them seemed prepared for paperwork, memory, and a mother who had finally stopped begging to be treated with respect and started measuring exactly what disrespect was going to cost. Sunday arrived with cold sunlight and one of those pale Midwestern skies that made every roofline look sharper than usual. Evelyn drove to the brunch restaurant 10 minutes early and sat in her car with the engine off, watching families move in and out through the front doors carrying diaper bags, flowers, and oversized purses. It was the kind of place Chloe would choose on purpose, polished but casual, expensive enough to signal taste, public enough to discourage conflict. Evelyn adjusted the cuff of her cream sweater, picked up her handbag, and walked inside with the steady posture of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning how to enter rooms without asking permission. Daniel was already there, standing when he saw her, his face arranged into an anxious version of warmth. Chloe remained seated in the booth, one hand around a coffee cup, smiling as if they were meeting after a scheduling misunderstanding rather than a deliberate exclusion. She looked immaculate, soft beige coat draped beside her, wedding ring positioned so clearly on her left hand that it might as well have been part of the table setting. Daniel hugged his mother too quickly, too lightly. Chloe offered a smile and said she was glad Evelyn came, which told Evelyn everything she needed to know. This was not an invitation. It was a test. The menus arrived. And for the first 5 minutes they spoke in the brittle language people use when they are pretending a bridge has not collapsed under them. Daniel mentioned work. Chloe complimented Evelyn's sweater. Evelyn ordered tea and listened. She noticed how often Chloe answered for Daniel before he could speak, how easily she redirected the flow of the conversation whenever anything uncomfortable drifted too close. Then, just after the food was placed on the table, Chloe leaned forward and gave a small sigh, as if she were about to discuss something unfortunate but necessary. She said she knew the last few days had been emotional, but they all needed to think practically now. Evelyn did not touch her tea. Daniel looked down at his plate. Chloe continued in the same measured tone, saying marriage changed timelines, responsibilities, and priorities. She said the condo felt cramped, that they had started discussing whether it made sense for Daniel to step more fully into his future, and that this might be the right time to simplify certain family arrangements before things became complicated later. The words were polished, but the meaning underneath them was blunt. Chloe was not trying to mend anything. She was trying to convert her new title into leverage. Evelyn let her finish. Then Daniel slid a manila folder across the table with a stiffness in his shoulders that made him look years younger, and much more foolish. He said it was nothing urgent, just a few planning documents, something to look over together so there would be no confusion down the road. Evelyn rested her fingertips on the folder, but did not open it right away. Instead, she asked what exactly they thought was confusing. Daniel started to answer, but Chloe stepped in first. She said the house was large for one person. She said maintenance was a burden. She said Daniel worried about Evelyn handling everything alone. She said it might be wise to discuss early transfer options, authorized access, and practical updates while everyone was in agreement. There it was, finally stripped down to its cleanest form. Not concern. Not family harmony. Access. Authority. Transfer. Evelyn opened the folder. Inside were printed summaries, suggested account changes, and a draft proposal that would allow Daniel to have expanded oversight tied to future property decisions. It had the look of something prepared in advance by someone who expected gratitude for being so organized. Evelyn read each page slowly while Daniel shifted in his seat, and Chloe watched her with the calm alertness of a woman waiting for a door to unlock. When Evelyn finished, she placed the papers back into the folder in perfect order and looked first at her son, then at his wife. She asked Daniel whether he had reviewed every line himself. He said yes, but his eyes slipped away before the word was fully out. Chloe jumped in to say they had only wanted transparency. Evelyn almost admired the nerve of that. Transparency, from the people who had hidden a wedding behind flowers and filtered photographs. She folded her hands on the table and spoke so quietly that both of them had to lean in to hear her. She said she was grateful they had finally decided to be direct. Chloe smiled, thinking this was surrender, but Evelyn continued in the same even tone and said that since they were discussing formal matters, it was only fair that everything now move through legal review. Daniel blinked. Chloe's smile held for 1 second too long, then faded at the edges. Evelyn watched the change happen in real time. The first crack in a confidence built on the assumption that an older woman would confuse motherhood with permanent permission. Daniel asked what legal review meant. Evelyn answered without raising her voice. She said it meant no documents would be signed, no access would be expanded, and no decisions about her property or the family trust would happen outside counsel. Chloe tried to recover, saying they were only having a conversation. Evelyn nodded and said conversations reveal intentions, and this one had been extremely helpful. For the first time that morning, Daniel looked genuinely unsettled. He asked whether this was really necessary. Evelyn met his eyes and let the silence do part of the work. Then she said something he would remember long after the plates had been cleared and the check had been paid. She said necessary was getting married without telling his mother. This was simply the paperwork that followed. After brunch, Evelyn did not rush home the way wounded people often do when they are still hoping distance will soften humiliation. She drove straight to Robert Gaines's office on Main Street, parked beneath the bare sycamore tree outside the building, and carried the trust binder inside with both hands as if it contained not paper, but weight she had finally decided to stop carrying alone. Robert met her in the conference room with a yellow legal pad, 2 printed statutes, and the kind of expression lawyers wear when they have already connected the emotional story to the financial pattern. Evelyn handed him the folder from brunch, along with the screenshots of the wedding and a clean timeline she had typed the night before. Robert read in silence for nearly 10 minutes, circling dates, underlining phrases, and marking a corner beside the draft that Chloe and Daniel had slid across the restaurant table. When he finally looked up, his voice was calm enough to settle the air. He said the good news was that nothing had been signed. He said the better news was that certain protections in the trust remained fully intact because transitional authority had not yet been triggered. Evelyn asked what that meant in plain English. Robert folded his hands and told her that Daniel had assumed marriage alone moved him into a stronger position, but under the documents her husband created, timing and disclosure mattered. Formal notice, good faith conduct, and review of any material change to household structure were all part of the framework. A secret ceremony followed immediately by pressure around property, and account access did not look like responsible planning. It looked like an attempt to get ahead of oversight. Evelyn did not smile, but something inside her settled more firmly into place. She had not imagined the pattern. She had recognized it. Robert advised her to suspend discretionary support, restrict informal access to records, and issue written notice that all future requests would be handled through counsel. He also suggested a broader review of beneficiary language, not because Daniel would be cut off automatically, but because trust is not just an emotion in families like hers. It is a legal condition. Evelyn stared at the line of morning traffic beyond the conference room window and thought about how often mothers are expected to accept disrespect as a stage of adulthood. She had done that for years in small ways. She had overlooked Chloe's thin smiles, her habit of calling Evelyn old-fashioned whenever she asked reasonable questions, the way she always spoke of boundaries when what she really wanted was unchecked influence. But a boundary is not the same thing as a secret, and privacy is not the same thing as exclusion. By the time Evelyn left Robert's office, she had signed nothing, promised nothing, and authorized 2 letters. The first was to the bank representative handling linked family accounts, instructing that no changes be entertained without direct written confirmation from her attorney. The second was to Daniel, brief and formal, stating that because of recent events, all discussions involving property, trust administration, and financial planning would move through legal review effective immediately. Robert offered to soften the language. Evelyn said no. Soft language had built the road that brought them here. That afternoon Daniel called 3 times. Evelyn did not answer. Then came the texts, first confused, then apologetic, then irritated. He said she was escalating things. He said Chloe was hurt that brunch had become so tense. He said they were only trying to plan responsibly. Evelyn read each message once and placed the phone face down on the kitchen table. Around 6, Marlene stopped by with a grocery store pie, and the kind of fierce loyalty that made her useful in a crisis. She sat across from Evelyn, listened to the attorney's summary, and shook her head slowly. Then she asked the question no one else had asked yet. She asked what Daniel had become willing to trade for approval. Evelyn did not answer right away because mothers spend years refusing to name weakness in their sons. But she could feel the answer forming anyway. He had traded discomfort for convenience. He had traded courage for peace at home. And worst of all, he had traded truth for access to a future someone else kept promising him. Later that evening, Chloe posted another photo set online, this time from what looked like a private dinner after the ceremony. Candlelight, polished silverware, a handwritten menu card, and the caption, "New beginnings with the people who truly support us." Evelyn looked at the sentence once and closed the app. It was a message, of course. Not subtle but deliberate. Chloe wanted the public version of the story to settle before the private consequences arrived. She wanted Evelyn framed as difficult, controlling, unable to let go. It was almost clever. Almost. But people who think image is power usually panic when paper starts moving. At 8:30, Robert forwarded Evelyn a copy of the letter sent to Daniel. She read the final paragraph twice. It stated that no assumptions should be made regarding future beneficial interests pending review of disclosure, conduct, and attempted changes to family-controlled assets. Evelyn set the phone down and looked around her quiet house. The lamp by the sofa was on. The dishwasher hummed softly in the kitchen. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into ordinary evening, porch lights coming on one by one. Nothing in the house looked different, and yet everything had changed. Chloe believed she had secured her place with one ceremony, one ring, and one carefully timed insult. Daniel believed his mother would eventually choose harmony over truth. But the letters had already gone out, the records were already under review, and for the first time since the betrayal began, Evelyn was no longer reacting to what they had done. She was shaping what would happen next. Monday morning brought the kind of quiet that feels earned rather than peaceful. Evelyn woke before sunrise, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with Robert's letter beside her unopened mail, as if placing it among ordinary things could make what it represented seem less final. It did not. By 8 o'clock, Daniel had already left 2 voicemails. In the first, he sounded confused and wounded, asking why lawyers were suddenly involved, saying everything had gotten blown out of proportion. In the second, confusion had hardened into frustration. He said Chloe was in tears. He said Evelyn was treating them like strangers. He said families were supposed to talk to each other before making legal moves. Evelyn listened to both messages without expression and deleted neither. She had learned that people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they still control the emotional terms of the conversation. At 9:15, Robert called with the first update from his review. He had spoken with the bank contact and confirmed that no unauthorized changes had gone through. He had also re-examined the trust language alongside a memorandum Evelyn's husband had signed years ago after Daniel's condo purchase. That document, almost forgotten, clarified the intent behind future support. Assistance was meant to stabilize Daniel's life, not subsidize any spouse, not replace earned responsibility, and certainly not reward concealment in matters affecting family governance. Robert read the line slowly over the phone, and Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment as she heard her husband's mind speaking through paper. He had known their son's generous heart. He had also known his weaknesses. Around noon, Daniel appeared at her front door unannounced. Evelyn saw his car through the lace curtain above the sink and felt no rush of panic, only a measured annoyance that he still believed access to her home was automatic. She opened the door but did not step back to invite him in. Daniel stood on the porch with his hands in the pockets of a jacket Evelyn had bought him one Christmas. His face pale from lack of sleep and something else she recognized immediately. Not remorse. Pressure. He started fast, saying Chloe had not meant any harm, that the brunch papers were just ideas, that the letter from Robert had frightened them. Evelyn asked one question before he could continue. She asked whether Chloe knew he was there. Daniel hesitated and, in that pause, Evelyn heard the entire marriage. He finally admitted Chloe thought it would be better if he handled this alone. Better for whom, Evelyn wondered, but she let him keep talking. He said marriage had come with practical realities. He said Chloe wanted security. He said couples needed to plan their future. Evelyn listened until he ran out of polished phrases and began sounding like himself again. Uncertain, defensive, a little ashamed. Then she asked whether he had told Chloe about the trust before the wedding. Daniel looked away toward the maple tree in the yard. And that was answer enough. He tried to say it was not like that. He tried to say Chloe only wanted clarity. But Evelyn had reached the point where euphemisms offended her more than the insult itself. She told him clarity would have been telling his mother he was getting married. Clarity would have been not arriving with property drafts hidden inside a brunch invitation. Clarity would have been choosing honesty before access. Daniel's shoulders sagged, and for one brief second she saw the boy he used to be, the one who hated disappointing anyone, especially when the truth finally cornered him. He asked if this meant she was cutting him out. Evelyn answered carefully because words matter most when they are least dramatic. She said she was not cutting him out. She was cutting confusion out. There would be no more informal conversations about money, no more assumptions, no more soft handling of disrespect disguised as planning. If his marriage was real enough to be hidden, then its consequences were real enough to be documented. Daniel stared at her as if he had never heard his mother speak that way before. Perhaps he had not. For years, Evelyn had translated her own hurt into patience, so he could keep feeling like a good son. She would not do that anymore. He asked if he could come in and talk properly. Evelyn said no. She said the next proper conversation would happen in Robert's office, with facts on the table and no one pretending this was about feelings alone. Daniel opened his mouth as if to argue, then stopped. He nodded once, not in agreement, but in surrender to a process he had not expected his mother to begin. When he walked back to his car, he looked older than he had. The week before. Evelyn closed the door, turned the lock, and stood in the entryway with one hand resting lightly on the brass knob. She did not feel victorious. Victory belonged to games and contests and small people keeping score. What she felt instead was steadiness, the hard kind that arrives when grief has burned off all illusion. At 3 that afternoon, Chloe finally sent her first direct message since the wedding. It was carefully worded, full of phrases about misunderstandings, heightened emotions, and how sad she was that things had become adversarial. At the bottom came the sentence that mattered. She hoped Evelyn would not make long-term decisions in a temporary emotional state. Evelyn read it twice and almost laughed, because there it was again, the same mistake Chloe kept making. She thought age meant fragility. She thought injury meant confusion. She thought an older woman defending what she built must be unstable, rather than informed. Evelyn forwarded the message to Robert without adding a word. Then she took the navy dress from the closet, removed the dry cleaning plastic, and hung it neatly in the guest room. She would not wear it to the wedding she had missed, but she kept it pressed and ready anyway, because some part of her knew there would still be a room ahead, one where appearances mattered, documents would be opened, and Chloe Bennet would finally learn that quiet women are often the most dangerous ones to underestimate. Thursday afternoon arrived with freezing rain tapping against the windows of Robert Gaines's office, and by then the meeting had already been set. Daniel would come at 4. Chloe would come with him. Robert had insisted on that point after reading her message, saying people who influence financial decisions should not hide behind second-hand explanations. Evelyn arrived 10 minutes early in a charcoal coat and low black heels, carrying nothing but her handbag and a slim folder of her own notes. She looked composed enough to unsettle anyone expecting a wounded mother. Robert greeted her quietly, then led her into the conference room where a long walnut table held 4 place settings, a pitcher of water, copies of the trust documents, and a legal pad already marked with dates. Evelyn took the chair at one end, not because it was dramatic, but because it gave her a clear view of the door. At exactly 4 o'clock, Daniel and Chloe entered together. Daniel looked tired. The soft skin beneath his eyes shaded darker than it had been a week earlier. Chloe looked polished as ever in a fitted camel coat and pearl earrings, but there was a new stiffness in the way she held her shoulders, the look of a woman trying to appear relaxed while calculating what she did not yet know. Robert began with introductions that felt unnecessary and therefore useful. He wanted the room formal from the first second. Then he outlined the purpose of the meeting in plain terms. There had been a recent marriage, undisclosed in advance to a principal family stakeholder. There had been immediate attempts to discuss property access and structural financial changes. There were now questions about timing, disclosure, and intent. Daniel shifted in his seat before Robert had even finished. Chloe folded her hands and offered a small, controlled smile, as if she believed charm could still blur the shape of the problem. Robert asked Daniel when the wedding had first been planned. Daniel glanced at Chloe, then said they had talked about it for about a month. Robert wrote the number down. Evelyn said nothing. Robert then asked who had drafted the brunch documents. Chloe answered before Daniel could speak. She said they had worked from a template online and a few suggestions from a friend in real estate. Robert wrote that down too. Then came the question Evelyn had been waiting for. Robert asked whether either of them had reviewed the trust provisions before the marriage. Daniel froze. Chloe did not. She answered that they had only tried to understand what responsible next steps might look like as a married couple. It was a careful answer, elegant and empty. Robert thanked her and asked again, more narrowly, whether they had discussed the trust specifically before the ceremony. Daniel's silence lengthened. Finally he admitted that he had mentioned it. Not in detail, he said quickly. Just broad outlines. Chloe added that any engaged couple would talk about the future. Robert nodded as though he agreed, and that was when Evelyn understood he was giving them room to settle into their own story before he tested its weak points. He turned a page and asked why the marriage had not been disclosed before it took place. Daniel said they wanted something intimate. Chloe said they were protecting their peace. Evelyn almost recognized the phrase now as a warning sign rather than an excuse. Robert asked whether intimacy required excluding Daniel's mother, while inviting Chloe's relatives, friends, and extended guests to a catered event. The silence after that was so complete that even the ticking wall clock seemed impolite. Chloe answered first. She said family dynamics had felt complicated. Robert asked whether those dynamics became less complicated when property paperwork was introduced 48 hours later. Daniel exhaled sharply and pressed his palms against the edge of the chair. Chloe's expression tightened for the first time. She said they were being painted unfairly. She said they had not asked for money. They had only asked for clarity. That was when Evelyn finally spoke. Her voice was level and almost quiet enough to disappear, which only made the room lean toward her. She said clarity would have been honesty before marriage, not strategy after it. Chloe turned to face her fully then, and whatever softness she usually performed for public settings was gone. She asked whether Evelyn was truly willing to damage her relationship with her son over what she called one hurt feeling. The sentence landed badly, not because it was loud, but because it revealed exactly how small Chloe believed the betrayal should appear when spoken by someone else. Evelyn did not flinch. She said this had never been about one feeling. It was about one decision leading directly into another, and both of them pointing in the same direction. Toward access. Toward control. Toward the quiet assumption that she would accept humiliation as long as it came wrapped in polite language. Daniel put a hand over his mouth then, as if he were hearing the entire sequence for the first time. Robert slid a document across the table and began explaining the review provisions that had now been triggered. Discretionary transfers were suspended. Property restructuring would be paused. Informal beneficiary expectations were under formal evaluation. No immediate punishment, no theatrical threat. Just process, signatures, and the slow closing of doors they had expected to walk through. Chloe's composure did not break all at once. It thinned. She asked whether this meant Daniel was being disinherited. Robert answered carefully. He said no final decision had been made. He also said beneficial standing depends not only on relation, but on conduct. Good faith matters. Timing matters. Temps. To influence control before proper disclosure matter. Daniel turned toward Chloe then with a look Evelyn had not seen on her son's face in years. It was not anger exactly. It was dawning recognition. The kind that arrives too late to protect innocence, but early enough to ruin denial. Chloe began to say something about misunderstanding and emotional overreaction, but the words no longer had the same power in the room. Paper had replaced performance. Dates had replaced tone. Evelyn sat with her hands folded in front of her, and watched the balance change inch by inch. A week earlier they had expected her to cry, forgive, and sign. Now they were reading clauses while a lawyer explained consequences. When the meeting ended, Robert gathered the documents into neat stacks and said follow-up would be issued in writing. Daniel stood slowly, looking as if the floor beneath him had shifted by several inches. Chloe rose beside him, still upright, still polished, but no longer certain of the script. Evelyn remained seated until they reached the door. Then she looked directly at Chloe and said the one thing that would follow her far longer than anything written on legal letterhead. She said very calmly, that secrecy is expensive when it is mistaken for power. The morning after the meeting, the town woke under a thin layer of ice that made every driveway shine like glass, and Evelyn stood at her kitchen window with a mug of coffee, watching the world harden in place while everything in her own life finally began to clarify. Robert had promised written follow-up by noon, but the shift had already happened the night before. Daniel had not called. Chloe had not sent another polished message about misunderstanding. Silence had settled where confidence used to be, and Evelyn knew enough about people to understand what that meant. They were no longer offended. They were worried. At 10:20, Robert emailed the formal summary. The review would continue for 30 days. During that time, all discretionary support would remain suspended. Any proposed changes to property oversight would be denied, and Daniel's future standing under the trust would be evaluated in light of disclosure failures and attempts to influence family-controlled assets immediately after the marriage. The language was clean, restrained, and devastating in exactly the way serious consequences often are. Evelyn printed the document, placed it in a fresh folder, and set it beside the fruit bowl on the counter, as if it were just another household paper. Then she went about her day. She folded laundry. She watered the fern in the living room. She paid the electric bill. There was something almost holy in the ordinariness of those tasks. Chloe had expected drama. What she got instead was process. By early afternoon, the first crack widened. Daniel called and asked if he could stop by after work. His voice had changed. Gone was the frustration, the injured son, the man still trying to pretend this was a misunderstanding. In his place was someone more fragile and far less certain. Evelyn agreed to meet him on the back patio, not inside the house. When he arrived just before 5, he looked as though he had not slept at all. He sat across from her in the cold with his coat still on and his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he barely touched. For a while he said nothing. Then, quietly, he admitted that he had not understood how much Chloe had been steering the timing, the secrecy, and the pressure afterward. He said she told him his mother would interfere, that Evelyn would make the wedding about herself, that if they wanted a clean start they needed to act first and explain later. He said the brunch paperwork had been Chloe's idea, though he had agreed to it because she convinced him everything would look more normal once the marriage was done. Evelyn listened without rescuing him from his own words. He kept going, as if confession might still earn him the version of grace he had always relied on. He admitted Chloe had asked questions about the house weeks before the ceremony. He admitted she knew more about the trust than he had claimed in Robert's office. He admitted she had pushed for fast moves because she believed delay only gave Evelyn more time to control the outcome. That sentence hung in the cold air between them longer than anything else. Control the outcome. Evelyn almost pitied the arrogance of it. Chloe had mistaken stewardship for control, caution for manipulation, maternal presence for a rival power center that had to be neutralized. Daniel finally looked up and asked whether any of this could still be fixed. Evelyn answered with the honesty he should have chosen much earlier. She said paperwork can be revised. Accounts can be protected. Titles can be restructured. But once a person decides to remove someone from the truth, what comes back is never innocence. Daniel stared into his cup as if the steam might hide him. Then he said Chloe was furious after the meeting. He said she kept calling Evelyn vindictive, saying no decent mother would threaten her son's future over one private ceremony. Evelyn let that sentence pass through her without reaction. She had noticed something important about women like Chloe. They often build their confidence on the belief that older women will be too ashamed to defend themselves plainly. They count on politeness. They count on guilt. They count on years of maternal sacrifice making boundaries feel unnatural. But once that spell breaks, all they have left is outrage that their strategy did not work. Daniel asked whether Chloe was right. He asked whether this really was punishment. Evelyn set her cup down and answered in the clearest words she had spoken all week. She said no. Punishment is emotional. This is administrative. Punishment seeks pain. This seeks truth. And if truth happens to be expensive, that bill belongs to the people who created it. Daniel looked at her then with the first real understanding she had seen in him since before the wedding. Not full maturity. Not redemption. But the beginning of it. He asked whether Chloe could come explain herself again. Evelyn said no. There would be no second performance, no revised script, no softer room in which Chloe could frame deceit as misunderstanding. Everything that mattered was already documented. Everything else was character. As dusk settled over the yard and the patio light clicked on above them, Evelyn saw her son begin to grasp the difference between being loved and being protected from consequences. He had enjoyed both for most of his life. From now on, he would need to learn one without expecting the other. When he finally stood to leave, he looked back at the house, then at his mother, and asked one last question in a voice so low it almost disappeared into the evening. He asked whether she thought Chloe had ever really wanted a family at all. Evelyn did not answer right away. She thought of the wedding photographs, the brunch folder, the online captions about peace and support, the hunger for access disguised as planning. Then she said that some people do not marry into a family because they want to belong. They marry into one because they want to reposition it. Daniel closed his eyes for a second, as if the sentence had landed exactly where it needed to. After he drove away, Evelyn remained on the patio until the cold finally pushed her inside. In the quiet of the kitchen, she looked at the printed summary from Robert and understood what the next few weeks would bring. Reviews. Decisions. Lines that could not be uncrossed. Chloe still believed this story was about a wedding and a wounded mother. But the truth was much larger now. It was about a woman who had built a life carefully enough that betrayal could not destroy it, only expose who had mistaken her kindness for weakness. 31 days after Robert Gaines opened the review, the final meeting took place under a clear winter sky so bright it made the courthouse windows across the street flash like mirrors. Evelyn arrived in the same charcoal coat she had worn before, but everything about her felt lighter now, not because the wound had disappeared, but because uncertainty had. Robert had spent the month tracing every relevant document, every timeline overlap, every attempt to accelerate access after the marriage. What emerged was not a crime, not a scandal in the dramatic sense Chloe might later describe to sympathetic friends over expensive coffee. It was something quieter and far more revealing. It was a pattern. Questions about the house before the ceremony. Discussions about trust language before disclosure. A private wedding presented as intimacy, followed almost immediately by pressure around control, timing, and future assets. By the time Daniel and Chloe entered Robert's office for the last time, there was no room left for performance. Daniel looked thinner than he had 6 weeks earlier, the confidence worn off him in layers. Chloe still looked immaculate, but the polish no longer read as effortless. It read as defensive. Robert began without flourish. After review, discretionary support from Evelyn would not continue in its previous form. No early transfer of the house would be considered. Daniel's future interest under the trust would remain conditional, phased, and individually protected from spousal influence to the fullest extent allowed under the documents. Additional safeguards would be added. Any future support would go toward clearly defined purposes only with oversight. Chloe would have no informal standing in decisions related to Evelyn's property, accounts, or estate structure. The words fell one by one, and each of them closed a door Chloe had once assumed would open with enough charm and timing. Daniel listened with his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. Chloe asked 2 questions, both carefully phrased, both answered by Robert in the same measured voice. No, this was not retaliation. Yes, conduct had influenced the outcome. Good faith mattered. Disclosure mattered. Attempted pressure after concealment mattered. At last Chloe turned to Evelyn, and for the first time since the wedding there was no polished softness left in her face. She asked whether this was really how Evelyn wanted to begin their life as family. Evelyn looked at her steadily and understood that this, more than the legal review, was the true last test. An older woman was being asked again to choose silence in exchange for the illusion of peace. Years ago she might have done it. She might have accepted the insult, financed the future, and called that love. But that woman no longer lived in this room. Evelyn said family does not begin with exclusion, and it does not deepen through strategy. She said what Chloe and Daniel built together was theirs to protect, repair, or damage, but it would no longer be financed by deceit or softened by her willingness to pretend she had not seen it clearly. Daniel flinched at that, not because the words were cruel but because they were exact. He finally spoke then, and his voice sounded stripped of every easy excuse. He said he had been wrong. He said he had told himself secrecy was temporary and that everything could be explained later, but later had turned out to be where character lives. He apologized, not elegantly, not perfectly, but plainly enough that Evelyn believed at least part of it. Chloe said nothing after that. She sat very still, as if still deciding whether anger or dignity would serve her better, and in the end she chose silence because there was nothing left to negotiate. When the meeting ended, Robert gathered signatures and handed out final copies. Daniel lingered near the door while Chloe stepped into the hallway to take a phone call she clearly did not need. For a moment mother and son stood alone in the room that had changed both of them. Daniel asked whether she still loved him. It was such a childlike question that Evelyn almost smiled. She told him love had never been the issue. Access was. Trust was. The difference between being someone's son and behaving like one was. Tears rose in his eyes, but she did not step forward to comfort him. Some distances must be crossed by the person who created them. She only told him that rebuilding was possible, but not quickly, and never again on the terms of convenience. Daniel nodded, and for once he did not ask her to make that easier. Outside, the air had turned sharp enough to sting her lungs, yet Evelyn felt steadier than she had in months. She walked past the courthouse windows, past the parked cars rimmed with salt, past the bakery on the corner where a young couple laughed over paper cups of coffee, and she understood something simple and permanent. Chloe had believed power came from being chosen in secret. Daniel had believed forgiveness would arrive before consequences finished speaking. Both of them had confused Evelyn's patience with frailty. They knew better now. By spring, the wedding photos disappeared from Chloe's social media. By summer, Daniel had moved into a smaller apartment alone while he sorted out what remained of his marriage, and Evelyn did not ask for details. She no longer chased truth from people determined to hide from it. She simply watched what their lives became once her money, her silence, and her benefit of the doubt were removed from the equation. The house remained hers. The trust remained protected. The future remained carefully structured, not out of bitterness, but out of respect for what her husband had built and what she had spent a lifetime preserving. On warm evenings, Evelyn sometimes sat on the back patio with a glass of iced tea and listened to the neighborhood settle into dusk, sprinklers ticking, dogs barking in the distance, screen doors opening and closing. The world had not ended because she was excluded from one wedding. Something more useful had happened instead. The lie had ripened too quickly and shown its full shape before it could root itself deeper into her life. In the end, Evelyn was not remembered as the mother who cried outside the circle and begged to be let back in. She was remembered, at least by the people honest enough to see it, as the woman who was pushed aside and answered not with chaos, but with clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, does not need to raise its voice to leave a mark.